When full-scale war broke out in Ukraine more than 2 years ago, young men queued up to fight against Russia. But with many Ukrainian troops now coming home in body bags, the number of new recruits has dropped sharply. How is Ukraine going to keep its front lines adequately staffed? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says the country has a 1 million-strong army to help fight Russia. But the fact that recruiters have to scour city streets to identify reluctant young people to join the army tells a very different story. And other frontline European countries are finding it similarly difficult to recruit soldiers. So, how will Europe find the troops it needs to deter Russia?
The West has supplied Ukraine with billions of dollars of missiles, fighter jets, and other weapon systems. But the one thing it can't do is to make Western soldiers available to Ukraine's armed forces as it struggles to fight off Russia.
Of course, the issue of people at the front is the number one issue. We have 880,000. We have an army of 1 million, and 30 million people are working, maybe a little bit more. I can't say the exact number because we don't know if 6.7 or 7.5 million are left from the beginning.
By almost every measure, Russia has superior numbers, be it the estimated manpower, active troops, reserve forces, paramilitary units, and even aircraft. The harsh realities of war make it difficult to mobilize more people who are willing to serve. Russia faces a similar situation. The Russian government has already resorted to several measures to increase its manpower. President Vladimir Putin recently said that their war effort involves nearly 700,000 troops bolstered by a new recruitment drive. But many Russians don't seem too keen to join.
I don't want to be a co-conspirator of those terrible crimes that my country did in its own borders. And what is particularly terrifying, massively outside, in particular killing thousands of Ukrainians without pity for women, children or the elderly, organising systemic torture, bombing residential districts, civilians. I don't want to be part of this. I want to directly resist.
Meanwhile, frontline European countries like Sweden, Finland and Estonia face their own military recruitment problems. Their conscription drive increased after the latest phase of Russia's military operation in Ukraine kicked off in February 2022. Leaders from Germany to the Netherlands are examining Sweden's successful model. Sweden currently screens over 100,000 teenagers a year. But Finland and Estonia still can't meet their military manpower needs despite conscription. Denmark and Lithuania use a lottery-driven conscription system that also falls short of targets. With birth rates falling across the continent, how will Europe defend itself from future military threats?
Let's meet our guests. Joining us from Moscow is Sergey Markov. He's a former public spokesman for Russian President Vladimir Putin. He's also director of the Institute of Political Studies. In Edinburgh, in Scotland, we have Stuart Crawford. He's a defence analyst and a former British Army officer. And I'm delighted to say here with me in the studio is Martin Smith. He's a senior lecturer in defence and international affairs at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. Gentlemen, you're all very welcome to Roundtable. Martin, I'll come to you first. I mean, poor wages, often substandard accommodation and housing, and a dangerous job. It's a tough sell in this modern world, trying to get young people to join up.
It is a tough sell, particularly when there are an ever-expanding range of job opportunities in the civilian world as well. But I think as well, something that's perhaps not discussed as much is the other side of the coin. What makes, certainly from the UK point of view, what also has made it a tough sell over the last decade or so is the fact that the British Army, for example, is in many respects underemployed. It's not engaged in major combat operations and hasn't been since the drawdowns from Iraq and Afghanistan. And a lot of the people who are interested in joining and a lot of the recruits that we get, so a lot of the officer cadets at Sandhurst, if you ask them what their motivation has been, they will say they basically joined up because it's the old cliches in some respect. They want to see the world and they want, if you like, a taste of adventure, and at the same time to feel that they are doing something worthwhile on behalf of their families, wider society and their country. So I think there's a bit of a paradox here, is the disincentives, I think, are magnified at a time when the armed forces, certainly of most Western nations, are underemployed in terms of the job that they are fundamentally paid and resourced to do, which is to be prepared, if necessary, to fight and hopefully win major wars.
Stuart, I'll just come to you. We'll talk about Russia and Ukraine in a moment. But Stuart, that's a good point Martin makes, isn't it? That, you know, a lot of young men in particular will be attracted to the adventure, the danger, the risk. And for a good number of years, for militaries like the UK, there just hasn't been a great deal going on.
Yes, I think that Martin's hit the nail on the head, actually. People certainly join the British Army and the British Armed Services for a whole host of reasons. I joined because I was fascinated by tanks and tank warfare, but I didn't really have any great desire to test it out in reality. And thankfully, that never came my way. I don't think the difficulty in recruiting has quite so much to do with pay, because the pay is competitive after a fashion. It's more to do with conditions of service in the British Army and the British services. The fact that the accommodation is poor, the fact that it's not seen, or the armed services are not seen as being an expanding, buoyant organisation, but rather, after many years of underfunding, an organisation in decline. And people who are ambitious, young people who are ambitious to make their way in the world, sometimes will look askance and say, well, actually, I can make a better fist of what I have elsewhere. So that's very definitely a problem. But it is, the great paradox is that when Britain goes to war, recruiting goes up. And Martin's absolutely right on that one.
Sergey, let's talk about the Russian situation and the conflict in Ukraine. How are your numbers doing? How difficult is it to get people to go and fight for Russia?
Now Russia have no problems. Russia use few, I would say, reasons for people to come to the front line. First, of course, money. And Russian soldiers getting something about $2,000 pounds, something about monthly, and also they're giving some additional money from the beginning. Also, Russian government guarantee for the children of soldiers on the front line that they will get special quotas for getting to universities, and studying at universities for the children of soldiers is free. Also, people usually taken from the economically depressive regions, and it means that money make more sense in those regions, but also the life a little bit boring in the modern life. And it's one of the reasons of advertising to Russian army is that you should have very intensive life. Another thing which is very important for the male is to be part of the team. Modern world too selfish, too one people, too autonomous life. And when male join the team, it makes them happy. So it's one of the reasons why young people go to the Russian army. Now Russia have no problems with this. More than 1,000 male go to the Russian army every day.
Every single day, 1,000 men are going to sign up for the Russian army. That's what you're saying, Sergey.
Yes, exactly. It's more than 1,000, a little bit more thousand. When end of last year, Russian government has a figure 900 per day. They just increase a little bit salary, and these figures come to something 1,100 per day.
Martin, just on that number, I'm guessing it's nowhere near like that for Ukraine, is it?
No, I think Ukraine, first of all, of course, has a significantly smaller population base. It has less than a quarter of the population size that Russia does, and indeed less than half the population of the UK. Demographically, it's a large territory, but demographically, it's actually quite a small country. Of course, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have fled overseas since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, mostly women and children, but that is significant because women play a significant role in the Ukrainian armed forces. But I think as well there's an interesting aspect to this, which perhaps isn't always discussed, and that is the extent to which the Ukrainian government, reflecting in its view the tolerance level of wider society, doesn't recruit as extensively as it could. So there was a big debate early this year about lowering the minimum recruitment age from 27 to 25, and that caused quite a lot of controversy and took quite a long while to get through the Ukrainian parliament. Now, many Western states and societies have significantly lower recruitment ages. So the British Army recruits from the ages, not into combat roles, but does recruit from the ages of 17 and 18, for example, and very commonly in Western countries, the minimum recruitment age is late teens, early 20s. So I think there's also a sort of a social and a cultural dimension in play in Ukraine, which begs the question, at what stage will the Ukrainian government feel that it needs to possibly revisit the issue of the minimum recruitment age again? But so far, it's decided, and President Zelensky's been very open about this, that it's, quote unquote, not willing to sacrifice the future of Ukraine, the youth of Ukraine, in a Russian-style meat grinder. So there's also a point drawing a conscious contrast between the Ukrainian approach to recruiting and staffing its armed forces and the perception, at least, that Russia basically doesn't value human life, and simply its approach is based on this idea of the meat grinder, is just throwing hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of young men mainly into the battle in the hope that it will make some sort of tangible gain as a result of that. So there's a cultural factor behind this as well, I think.
Stuart, give us your view on what it means for the war in Ukraine if Russia's able to recruit 1,000 young soldiers every single day and Ukraine simply can't because of the difference in population. What does that do for the war going forward?
Well, I mean, I think the figure of 1,000 recruits a day is quite astonishing, actually. And I don't think there's any way that the Ukrainian state can match that in any way, particularly if it doesn't reduce the minimum age for entering the armed services from 25, which I think is very high indeed. I'm used to recruits arriving at regimental level from 18 and 19 years onwards. So, and if there's one lesson that comes out of Ukraine, where lots of military commentators have been sort of seduced by the idea of techno-romanticism, if I can use that term, where they seem to believe that new technology, artificial intelligence, et cetera, is a substitute for personnel. I think that is completely and utterly mistaken. The big lesson from the Ukrainian conflict is that numbers matter. And so at some point, the Ukrainians are going to have to come up with a scheme whereby it's lowering the age of entering the armed services, widespread conscription, whatever it may be, to up the number of people going in to their armed forces, if only so they can rotate units out of the front line and give them a rest from time to time.
Sergey, that figure you said, 1,000 Russians joining the army every single day, if that is the case, if that is true, that figure, why have you gone to prisons and offered prisoners deals to get out for their freedom if they will fight for a certain period on the front line in Ukraine?
Now it's already doesn't work. Now this recruiting of the prisoners already doesn't work more than a year. Because from the beginning, it was Russian Russian policy of the recruiting soldiers has a few periods. One period, then it was just professional army from the beginning. It was small enough, and it was no mobilization in Russia, but it was a very big mobilization in Ukraine. And in fact, in the beginning of 2023, as a result, Ukraine, which had population effect in 5 times less than Russia, has on the front line the number of soldiers twice more than Russian soldiers on the front line. And that's why in the 222 on autumn, Ukrainian army took partly control of the Kharkov regions. Everybody could go to the internet and see that sometimes Ukrainian soldiers just go between very long, big distance of Russian soldiers. So after this, Vladimir Putin made a decision to make a mobilization of 300,000 people, but for the time to make them recruiting, it was some gap when Russia very much needed soldiers. That's why Wagner Group go to the prisoners, and I knew personally the head of Wagner Group, and he was very tough, and he was a little bit criminal himself. He spent a few years in the prison, and he come here. He took them. Then this time gap, have been occupied by these soldiers from the prison. But then this mobilized 300,000 people come to the army, and then Russia founded this very good model. It's combination of the ideology and good salary. And now, already more than a year, Russia doesn't have any some kind of programs for the getting prisoners to the war.
Martin, I want to take a look at a recent survey in the UK, attitudes amongst young people to war and military and serving. So this is a survey that was done by YouGov. It's a poll of 18 to 40-year-olds. 7% said they would volunteer if a world war broke out. 7%. 21% would serve if conscripted. 38% said they would refuse to serve even if conscripted. Seems the younger generation just literally aren't that interested in military service.
I think that's right, and I think that reflects a deepening distance between British society generally, particularly younger people, and their armed services, because we've had since the early 1960s the fully professional model. There's been no kind of conscription, unlike many mainland European NATO allies who maintain various models of conscription all the way through the Cold War and in some cases beyond. So I think the underlying problem there is the fraying of the connection, that people in wider British society don't feel connected to their armed forces, not just in a structural institutional sense, but in a wider cultural sense as well. I think also an additional, in some respect, positive factor is that the UK has been, when it's been engaged militarily, has been engaged in what are sometimes referred to as wars of choice as opposed to wars of necessity. In other words, not having to fight for our national survival, not having to fend off an armed attack on the UK itself, but actually getting involved in military operations alongside the United States or as part of NATO for essentially political and ideological reasons. So I think that is a real problem. It's not a problem with an easy solution. I think Stuart is right. I think there are, having said that, improving the standard of military accommodation, which, as Stuart has indicated, is a big and ongoing issue with serving personnel. And the other side of the coin as well is not just a recruitment challenge. The Army and other armed services also have a retention problem, actually persuading the people who are already signed up to extend their terms of services and not sign off because, for example, they're dissatisfied with accommodation and feel that they actually would be better off from that point of view in Civvy Street. So there are a whole host of major social and cultural as well as economic and political challenges in play here, which hopefully government in the UK, as you know, has just initiated a new defence review. Hopefully these will be given due and serious consideration this time round.
Stuart, I just want to look at some statistics from the number of young people who tried to join the British Armed Forces last year. 137,000 applied to join, but 74,000 gave up after 6 months because the process was taking too long. Do you need to speed up recruitment?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. And the problem is very much one of the fact that previous governments outsourced recruiting away from the armed services and the Ministry of Defence to various private companies. And in the case of the British Army, which is really the only one I can speak about with any sort of real knowledge, it's proved to be absolutely disastrous. I won't name the company which has the contract, but it's easy enough found out. And the real problem is the bottleneck between application and being actually entering into recruit training. Sometimes a year, sometimes a year and a half, which frankly is just not good enough. And I do hope that the Defence Review will reverse the decision to outsource that to a civilian company and bring it back in-house. Because in terms of understanding what you're letting yourself in for as a young would-be recruit, there's really no substitute for going down to your local recruiting office and speaking to Staff Sergeant MacDonald, for example, and he will tell you, one, whether he thinks you're suitable material, but also what to expect when you join the army. So I think that has been a major disincentive in terms of the number of people who have managed to make their way through the system. The number of recruits seems to be perfectly adequate, or would-be recruits, applicants, seems to be perfectly adequate, but they're just not getting through the system.
Sergey, you must laugh in Russia when you see newspaper stories about big powers like the UK struggling to get soldiers into their armed forces.
Some people laughing, but not me. I understand that Great Britain now live in a situation of peace. And that's why the whole mass culture is saying to the people, you should enjoy your life, make it fun, even less walking, more funning, go to the Spain on the beach and so on, go to the football match to see how this millionaires taking their money. So it's the main ideology of the Western society. If they, not they, meaning elite, British elite, decided that Great Britain should take part in the war, they will change this propagandistic approach of the mass culture, I would say, not just clear information propaganda. And immediately some people will come here. I'm sure that this is problem of the very good life of the people who live in Great Britain. So, and they also found very good solution. You know, from our point of view, Ukrainians, they're Russians, but Ukraine is occupied by United States, Great Britain, and NATO countries, and it's stand behind Barack Obama strategy concept. It means that proxy war is mostly good. And I think it's a very smart decision of the British American elite to fight against Russia by Russian hands and Russian life of the Ukrainian slaves. Because we regard these people as slaves, because Ukrainian regime from our point of view, very repressive and not democratic. And also, look, 70% of the Ukrainian people, they have native language Russian. They're fighting for what for? That for children, for them will be prohibited to speak, to get education by their native language. So it's only slave who do it. So it's very wise and Satana-style decision of the British and American elite what they're doing in Ukraine.
Martin, in terms of recruitment and national service, have some of the Scandinavian countries got it right? I mean, Sweden seemed to have a very good system of getting young people in. Do you think something like that might be applicable to the British Armed Forces?
I think it's certainly worth looking at, because the trouble is conscription, phrases like conscription and national service are loaded terms in the UK and indeed in other contexts. I think an interesting model that certainly is worthy of serious study from the UK's perspective is the Finnish model, because Finland has a very small population.
What, 5 million?
Just over 5 million, and small standing armed forces, but it has a well-tested capability to rapidly mobilise a reserve, a military reserve of around about 300,000. So it's less the idea of conscription in the sort of 1950s UK model, I think, and more this idea, a similar version is practised in Switzerland, for example, what's sometimes referred to as the founding of the concept of the citizen at arms. In other words, this idea that, yes, you maintain a small professional standing army to be the nucleus of your military capability and your defence effort, but if necessary, in times of crisis and significant threat, you set in place means to be able to augment that very significantly.
Stuart, Sergey and Martin here with me in the studio. Thank you all so much for your insight. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. And if you like what you see there, please do hit that subscribe button. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.